is, I suppose, like spaces of America is so tied into the idea of freedom. So you want to try to find like new free spaces in which things can happen, like new free markets, new free geography, new resources, space exploration. A lot of these ideas, of course, are global, but they're also tied into American values. And so I think in some ways I'm kind of locked into that, into that sort of American ideology.
Yeah. I mean, we're also just where we're from and where we are. And you never feel as, I would imagine, American here as you do when you're in Europe. Like, I would never feel Swedish in Sweden. I don't feel particularly Swedish right now, but maybe European, to be honest.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, a lot of what I was inspired by that sort of influences my digital paintings is a lot of computer games and video games that I played while I was growing up. And those computer and video games, some of them are American, but a lot of them are from Asia and from Europe. So I think that I do kind of have a sort of globally influenced aesthetic because of that. But of course, a lot of those games, like for example, Pokemon, is sort of modeled after more of a Western. Even though it was made in Japan, it's sort of modeled after more of a Western town kind of like layout and stuff like that. So it's. Yeah.
Yeah, but I was thinking during your lecture, there's such an amazing, or let's put it this way, you use technology and pencil on paper in a very, very, you kind of use both of these mediums without really thinking about now it's a projection and you do that. I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but I think it's something interesting about how you employ these things like the pencil or the objects and then the digital. Is that how you grow up? Playing video games and drawing on paper?
Yeah, I did do a lot of those two things. I would like play video games and then also make a lot of drawings, and the drawings would be really playful, and I would make characters and try to have them interact and stuff like that. And I never really made like comics or like kind of painting drawings. I would do drawings that were like, they were kind of systems where things were happening to other things. And so, yeah, definitely in a way, I thought of drawing as a kind of video game because I would draw when I didn't have my Game Boy or something in school. So drawing was like actually a replacement for interactive images. Like literally I would draw when I didn't have the electronics. So in that sense, I think I am kind of trained to paint in a way in which I like to think about the image as being this like interactive, limited kind of space. Yeah, and so I think that sort of really influenced me. I think in terms of like using different media and like not really treating them as being one being better than the other one or whatever, I think that's not a very American idea. I mean, I think like one of the downsides of American culture is that we try to like privilege the new technology and say like, oh yeah, you don't have to, write cursive anymore. We have keyboards and things like that now or whatever, or like you don't have to use this thing anymore. We have this thing now, right? But of course, if you go over to Europe, people are much more skeptical of newer technologies, especially the ones that come from America. So but in my work, I try to not privilege any particular media, if that makes sense. I like to think of all the media as being kind of on the same plane. So I like to think, even if we have a brand new technology, I still like to think that, perhaps things artistically can still go in any direction, I would say probably my favorite example of this is like beatboxing. It's like a really easy example to understand where you have like, some acoustic drums. And then at some point in the 80s and 70s, you get like machines that sort of like badly simulate those drums. And then you have people who couldn't afford those machines who sort of simulate those machines. And then beatboxing itself has become its own sort of niche art form that's evolved beyond those machines. So like often things go in different directions, like so you go electronic back to acoustic, but you couldn't actually have beatboxing without the electronic technology. So that becomes a very interesting idea too. So often with, one of the ideas behind digital painting that I'm working with is how do we actually go back to older media with the things that we've learned from the newer technologies? And how can we actually expand our idea of the newer technologies or expand just the idea of digital painting using older media? How can older media actually be much better than at exploring certain ideas than the computers are?
Oh, that's interesting. So so how about the element of control here then? Because then you have to be able to navigate or to use all these various tools. You have to be really mindful about what you're doing here. Because then you have a lot of different techniques. You have to have a lot of knowledge about so many different things, right?
Yeah.
I think the element of control is interesting. Because if not, you're just playing around with something.
Right.
Because you want some kind of end result of it all. Like you want to control it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, so there's this really great programmer who is one of the programmers who inspired me to be a programmer. And he says about programming, or basically doing any creative project, is that in the beginning he says all you want are results, but then by the end you only want control. So for example, if you were to set out to write a novel and you were using Microsoft Word, in the beginning you might just use the default template or something like that. But by the end of the novel, you may have like customized that template a lot because you want certain kinds of control over. But then by the end, when you're ready to print the novel, you have to go to another program that has more typographic control or something. So you shouldn't have been writing it in Microsoft Word all along, or like that kind of. Yeah. So in the beginning, you want to just use something that gets you results, and then in the end, you want a lot of control over those results. So that's one way to think about like any creative project. And in terms of tools themselves, I think as a designer of tools, and like as a designer of drawing systems, and then as a user of those drawing systems, I'm constantly thinking about that kind of thing. Like, how can I build a drawing tool that gives me some results, but still lets me have the level of control that I want? And of course, with painting media, whether it's digital painting or what, you have different granular levels of control, right? Like with oil paint, you have much more control than you could ever have with a digital, sort of like a digital media. You can get more detailed and stuff like that. But of course, you don't have certain kinds of control, like you can't filter the whole thing or whatever, right? So it's all about these negotiations of control in your tools. But often the simplest tools, I think, are the best to explore new ideas. And that's because they just have fewer options. They're also better for collaboration. For example, if you and I were to make a drawing with pencil, and we both used the same exact pencil, very quickly you just get into this idea where you can forget about the pencil itself, and then you're just thinking about the thought that comes out of the pencil, right? But if you and I are doing the same kind of collaboration in Photoshop, and you could use all the different features of Photoshop, you would probably... If we were using all the different features of Photoshop, you would probably be thinking about Photoshop features when looking at the final image, as opposed to what you and I were thinking about while drawing, right? So simpler tools tend to go into the background much more quickly. And when your tool retreats to the background, the faster your tool can sort of like become the background for thought, which becomes the foreground, then the better you are at thinking, I think.
So do you work on a lot of collaborative projects right now?
Yeah, so a lot of my lectures in Europe have been in collaboration with this artist Goody Pal and his band Goody Pal and Pals, or GP and PLS, and they do a lot of like political work. And I do some of the art theory kind of side of things. And so the collaboration occurs both at the performance level, where like as I'm lecturing, there's sounds being generated behind me, and as they're playing songs, I'm doing imagery with my different software. But it also occurs like, sometimes I'll draw with other people and other painters, and I make up games with my friends and stuff. And I've also given lectures where it's not just me, but it's me and two other painters, and we switch between our machines and try to create some sort of like dynamic where we're both talking about pictures at once. So my collaborations tend to be more on the social scale than just on the pictorial sort of scale. But I have done some like group paintings where we basically pass the same device back and forth every 3 minutes or something like that. But one thing about collaboration that I think is really interesting, especially for painters, or if you're drawing, is like the thing that I've learned is that it's more important to watch somebody else draw than it is to actually just draw on the same surface with them. So if you're going to draw with somebody, I would suggest that the way you do it is like you watch them draw for 3 minutes, and then they give you the paper, and then you draw for 3 minutes, but they watch you draw for 3 minutes. And actually, from watching somebody, it's much more important to watch somebody than it is to actually just add marks to something that they've made. Because it's, digital painting is all about, I guess we were talking about how, all the mystery has to come out of the process, right? And so if you want to understand somebody, you have to understand the mystery of their process. So by observing how they're making the lines on the picture, you learn a lot more than just seeing like what the lines were after they were made, if that makes sense. Same with like a Solowit drawing, right? You don't learn much from the drawing itself. You have to learn about how the drawing was made in order to even get meaning out of the thing.
Wow. Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you so much. I think I've learned a lot listening to you.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
I think I've learned some stuff from talking.
That's always good, isn't
Yeah.
it?
That's how I learn most things.
Yeah, it's always the best, isn't it? Just to learn and listen and learn and be in the world. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. And it's great to meet you this week.
Very nice to meet you. Let's see if we can find the stop button. The button that's over there.
This one.
No, it's over there.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.